with deliberation as an epistemic network, a method for analyzing discussion. So the structure of the session today will be about 10 minutes of presentation per paper and per group. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A, but feel free to use the chat as you would like to ask your questions as the sessions are going. I know many of these individuals, and they'll be more than happy to answer anything that you ask as you go. So take it away, Brendan and your team.
Sorry, give me a second. I just had to unmute myself and finish my sharing. Can you guys see a deer right now? Excellent. Step one complete. And let me, ooh, you get a sneak peek of what I'm doing. All right, here we go. And give me one more second. I gotta switch the view. Thank you for bearing with me while everything gets set. All right, do we see just my slide? No notes or anything? Okay, so my name is Brendan Egan. I'm the Associate Director for Partnerships and Community Engagement at the Epistemic Analytics Lab at UW-Madison. And I'm really excited to be presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Peter Levine from Tufts University and David Williamson Schaefer here with me at UW-Madison. Peter couldn't join us because he had non-refundable tickets, so I think he's in a metal tube above the earth somewhere right now. But if you are interested in what we discuss, I would definitely reach out to him and me afterwards to if you find what we talk about at all interesting. So for those of you who went through schooling in the United States, you may have been exposed to this image. This is something that I pulled from Wikipedia, but this is the beating of Charles Sumner, which occurred on May 22nd in 1856 in the United States Senate chamber when the Representative Preston Brooks on the left, who was a pro-slavery Democrat from South Carolina, used a walking cane to attack Senator Charles Sumner, an abolitionist Republican from Massachusetts. And the attack was in retaliation for a speech that was given by Sumner 2 days earlier, in which he fiercely criticized slaveholders, including a relative of Brooks. And the beating nearly killed Sumner and contributed significantly to the country's polarization over the issue of slavery. And it's often considered symbolic of the breakdown of reasoned discourse and deliberation and the use of violence that eventually led to the Civil War. So sorry for that kind of stark and violent start here. You know, deliberations and kind of an ideal about deliberations would be that they could be discussions about what an institution or community or nation could do or should do. And it's important to democracy. So deliberations allow individuals to influence public opinion and official decisions and may also convert opinions and desires into more reflective judgments. And so deliberations are a subset of conversations that meet certain normative criteria such as reasonableness and equity, although those criteria are debated. That's not necessarily settled. And deliberations are at home in the public sphere. So just to kind of contextualize these types of discussions. And deliberative skills are necessary to discuss controversial issues, ones where people don't necessarily agree, that face institutions, communities, and nations. And in a really interesting paper at the last ICQE conference, Eric Hamilton and Woodson Hobbs, who sometimes goes by Quinn and is also elusive in terms of photographs on the internet for me to put up here with Eric, they had quite an interesting paper that looked at modeling political discourse. And they identified 5 phases of discursive transactions. So starting with an input, you think about what you see or receive, you have an emotional reaction to that, like emotional generation, you adapt to what you think and feel, and then you respond to the discourse. And obviously this could be a cyclical process. And they also identified emotional grammars within this process that have their own logic, but could lead to emotional and behavioral traps. That's my interpretation of the work there. And I'll give you some examples of those types of logic. One could be, you claimed something about me that's unfair and untrue, and so I'm going to attack you in return. That would be the logic, but that doesn't actually engage with the specific issue. So a kind of ad hominem issue. Or if you perceive someone to be saying something that you think is false, you might think that they deserve scorn or need to be attacked. Again, not really engaging with the issue, but kind of falling into this emotional response. And they defined this as kind of dysfunctional discourses or cycles of surface level conflicts that miss critical challenges involved in addressing important issues. So for those of you who've been brave enough to actually like dive into the comment sections of online discussions, you might see how ugly these interactions can get. And unfortunately, the incentive structures for media and social media push us into these types of cyclical conflict. It's beneficial for them monetarily to get eyeballs on ads and on their sites and things like that. Or they can also push us at the other end of the spectrum to stay in bubbles of like-minded people. Again, not actually engaging with the specific content issues, but kind of pushing us to these different behavior patterns. So now where Eric and Quinn examined vitriol in online discourse where people fail to meaningfully engage with a difficult issue. Breakdowns in deliberative discourse can lead to scenes like the beating of Charles Sumner. So this is the Ukrainian parliament where we see some similar issues. This is from Japan, South Africa. Here in Taiwan, we see a legislator that's being silenced. In Italy, in Mexico, in Turkey, there's many more of these images, but I'm sure many of you have seen the images and violent events that occurred on January 6th in Washington, D.C. These aren't isolated incidents. So what skills do lawmakers or citizens more broadly need to avoid these types of dysfunctional discourses? I'm going to turn to our study, which focused on online discussions of controversial topics at two schools, Tufts University and Kansas State University, which I'm going to refer to as Tufts and KSU. And each of these schools separately conducted 3 deliberations in online forums where students discussed the social determinants of health, sexual assault, and mental health. And the study I'm sharing with you today focuses just on the discussions from the social determinants of health online forum. The forum posts were coded using this codebook. Themes of looking at people's upbringing, talking about how they were raised, or how people are raised, prejudice and discrimination, so unfair treatment against groups of people based on a number of different factors, opportunities that people could have that could lead to different health outcomes, class or socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, daily decisions, personal choices that people make and how they live their lives, and finally, hard work. And you can, if you look at the paper, you can actually go through a lot of these examples and definitions more closely. And all of this coding was validated using social moderation. So 3 raters coded the data separately and then came together and discussed differences until those were resolved. Initial agreement was fairly high, so it didn't take too many iterations to come to the agreement on the coding. So we modeled connections between these codes that students made in the forums using epistemic network analysis, or ENA. And here we can see a student making a connection between race and prejudice in one post. What bothers me the most is that Blacks have such a high risk of illness and disease simply because of America's history in which Blacks are inferior. Racism, discrimination, stereotypes all factor into the outcomes of well-being and health of Blacks and minorities across America, which are in part are all affected by the environment in which these groups of people live. So that's just giving you a sense of the types of connections that a student might make in these discussions. Here we can see the mean or average network of posts from Tufts University. And the most prominent connection that came up for all of these students were connections between, at Tufts, was between class and race and ethnicity. Many of the Tufts students emphasized the ways that race and class could work together to reinforce inequities. Someone refer to this as intersectionality issues, right? Where things can kind of be multiply reinforcing. In contrast, students at Kansas State University, or KSU, made most connections between class and upbringing, followed closely by connections between class and race and ethnicity, and between upbringing and race and ethnicity. And the KSU students were more focused on what they perceived as different behaviors from people from higher or lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and they disagreed about the reasons for those differences. That was a kind of a key feature of their discourse. In both groups, students reported that after the discussion that the topic was important, they had carefully considered other people's views and understood what other people said, and that others had understood them. That was kind of common across both of these discussions. And in both groups, students reported that the discussions had helped them to understand the topic. Here's the subtraction network that lets us see kind of a contrast in the discourse patterns a little bit more clearly, with class and upbringing being much more prominent at KSU in red, and connections between daily decisions and prejudice and discrimination over on the left being stronger at Tufts. So here we can define the x-axis of this ENA space as being more about personal beliefs on the left and upbringing on the right, and class being much more central. And the difference in the patterns of connections we saw between the two schools in the networks was statistically significantly different. And while those results and differences are interesting in and among themselves, more generally in this study, we were aiming to demonstrate how ENA could be used to assess deliberation and inform the development of normative principles for and principled assessments of deliberative discussions. So a great deal of evidence shows that from social sciences supports the consensus view that in the Tufts classroom that race and class do affect health outcomes. So as a result, we could argue that the difference in the two discussions was that there was a greater degree of sophistication or awareness among Tufts students. On the other hand, as measured by ENA, the Tufts students did not make as many connections across as many topics or ideas as the KSU students did. They did not grapple with or even experience a set of opinions that came up at KSU and were incorporated into a more complex epistemic network for the class as a whole. So one implication for instructors who are trying to foster deliberative discourse skills may be that existing disagreements within a class can actually serve as a deliberative asset, right? That could be helpful for developing these types of skills. Topics on which students happen to disagree provide better practice for deliberation. And from this perspective, a drawback from Tufts conversation was the relative similarities of opinion. When a group is focused on a relatively small number of issues, we might want to choose readings or other prompts that expand the range of ideas that the students can incorporate into their arguments, like if you have a relatively homogeneous group of students. So while Tufts students may have been more aligned with an expert viewpoint, from a deliberation standpoint, they may have engaged in a bit of an echo chamber, engaging mostly with similar ideas and outlooks. And we could think about echo chambers being on that phenomenon being at the one end of a spectrum, and dysfunctional discourses described by Hamilton and Hobbes, or just a total breakdown of civil discourse into violence at the other end of the spectrum. Deliberative discourse skills need to be developed somewhere in the middle, where people actually hear different ideas and perspectives, and better yet, engage with them in order to address controversial topics and challenges we face in society. In the end, judgments as to the quality of deliberation require normative principles. However, our analysis here shows that these network analyses can accomplish two important steps toward the ultimate goal of evaluating these skills and discussions. First, the analyses reveal aspects of conversation that pose normative issues and thus could lead to the development of principled assessments if we want to measure these things, if we want to actually teach them in schools potentially. And moreover, the network analyses provide quantitative measurements that allow us to implement those kinds of assessments. So this study is just showing one potential analytic approach in this area, and it also suggests a few next logical steps. So here's some limitations in future work. The first is that segmentation was rather coarse for this initial analysis. We just segmented at the post level and coded at the post level. We've done subsequent analyses that are more fine-grained. Also, we didn't include valence. So if someone said race is a factor or is not a factor, that's not included in this. Just the fact that they merely talked about it and connected to each other, other ideas. We also didn't address directionality. So if certain ideas led to other ideas more often, or even influence of individual contributors. So someone could maybe influence the discussion in a big way, which I think is an important aspect of thinking about deliberation. And as I've said before, future work should focus on articulating norms for functional deliberation and political discourse. The other thing I want to mention is we only attended to the discourse contributions themselves here, right? So, but we remember that this is a process that can loop back, and there's 4 other steps that come beforehand. So we might want to think about metacognitive or meta-emotional skills, like in terms of how do I think about thinking about things? How do I think about the emotions that come up and how these things interact? And what does that mean in terms of my adaptive responses to these things? So I'm probably over time, but thank you all for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and interaction with everybody else.
You are right on schedule. Thank you so much, Brendan. That was fascinating. I've got questions already written.
I gotta figure out, give me a second here. My screen did not, it blacked out and I can't click on the stop sharing.
Oh, I think I can stop for you. If,
thank you.
Yes.
This is why, thank you.
So I don't know if me sharing my screen will kick you out. Did that happen? You look, does anyone see it? Okay, good. It was a little hacky, but I think it worked. Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you again. So next up, we've got democracy and social inequalities in the organization of education during the COVID-19 pandemic, the case of Brazil and Sweden. Oh, I love this paper. Sorry, Daniel and Caroline, I'm not, who is presenting?
Stefano, you are presenting, right? Yeah. So I'm starting a little bit. So hi everyone. Really nice to see the familiar and unfamiliar faces attending this session. My name is Caroline and I'm a doctoral student at the Department of Education at Umeå University. where I'm researching digital technologies in education, and I'm in Sweden, by the way. So on behalf of my research team, Stefano and Daniel, I'm happy to start off our part of the seminar by welcoming you to the presentation of our paper entitled Democracy and Social Inequalities in the Organization of Education During the COVID-19 Pandemic, the case of Brazil and Sweden. So go ahead, Stefano.
Hello, you all. I'm Stefano from São Paulo, Brazil. This first slide I would just read should be more objective and direct, and then we can talk more to the next slide, just to present briefly the paper. So we have here the paper proposition. It is the role of state and citizen subjectivity in the 21st century in times of social distance, the challenge of committing basic education to the reduction of social inequalities and the advancement of democracy from the preservation of Brazil and Sweden. So our K can be how are democracy and social inequality expounded in Brazil and Sweden's way of organizing education during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the justification we put here, that is, in a globalized world, comparative studies between countries with deep historical and social difference can help the denaturalization and the visibilization of specificities that are structured by and are structured of individual and global existence. So we have individual here.
Stefano, sorry for interrupting, but we can't see you moving the slides.
Oh, I just in the.
If you're doing that, sorry for interrupting you.
Go into presentation mode. I think there's usually a little button at the bottom right-hand corner of the PowerPoint, or you can go up to the top and do File, Present.
Okay. So
or it actually would be.
Let me just start sharing. I think we'll be right. Can you see now?
Pardon.
Not yet.
No, so try going under View on the top, View, and then Slideshow.
Okay.
Jacob also mentions that Zoom sometimes has different sharing options as well.
I think when you share your screen, you have an option to present the presentation versus sharing your screen. So when you go back into share screen, you might want to also try that setting as well.
Right.
Okay.
And if not, you can maybe just flip through in the program itself. It might not be full screen, but we can still see your slides.
That is true, yes. So if you want to, you can use the slide column on the left-hand side of your screen, and you'll just have to click each number as you move between slides.
Okay. It's good now? Not yet, right?
So if you click slide 2 on the left-hand column, then we'll be able to see slide 2. And so you'll have to do that, unfortunately, a bit manually, but now we can see every slide as you go.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, people, for that.
No problem. Of the beast, could go right ahead.
Okay, so just to be briefly, it's the role of state and citizenship active in the 21st century in times of social distance, the challenge of committing basic education to the reduction of social inequalities and the advancement of democracy from the observation of Brazil and Sweden. And that justification, we are comparing two different historical and cultural countries to denaturalization and visibilization of specificities that are structured by and structured of individual and global existence, being very shortly. We're talking about two individuals, Brazil and Sweden, but we are talking about conservatism, authoritarianism, neoliberalism that are global existence and how they manifest in each country during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in educational change. So, Caroline.
Yes, next
Okay.
slide, please. Thank you. So the comprehensibility and transparency offered by the QE theories, methodology, and tools beneficially inform the research collaboration that we made and also the results. And I will go into this now. So shortly on this slide, you can see the 8 data processing stages that we made. Initially, we observed the discourses forwarded by the Brazilian and Swedish governments during the year of 2020 and 2021, when the COVID-19 pandemic had advanced worldwide. And the government's discourses we thought were relevant to explore because they were considered to contain information about the changes in the organization of education related to the 2 aspects of democracy and social inequality, which we were going to investigate. So we started off by performing manual searches on the respective countries' web pages, and we operated several selection criteria available in full in the paper. Text data from each country was manually downloaded and imported into separate documents, and we worked a lot with translating and cleaning the file, especially important and preparatory for the coding in encoder, which I will come back to. And we conducted a first round of segmentation, which included separating the text into lines or clusters of lines, depending on how the content qualitatively addressed or framed different coherent aspects of social inequality and democracy communicated. And all text data was then transferred to a spreadsheet and resulted in 3,766 rows for the entire dataset. And I want to put some emphasis on the code generation, since it's a crucial part of the QE methodology and also foundational for how you get to know your data, how you ought to work successfully with the tools, and in the end, what knowledge claims you can make. So first, some basics around that. The initial stage of code generation included hypothesis modeling related to the deductive part of our aspirations to model democracy and social inequality. So in this modeling, we used both bottom-up and top-down approaches to the data, from which we established the components of our epistemic frame, the code words that made up the codes that corresponded to the democracy and inequality aspects that we wanted to know more about, and which connections we were going to model in network graphs. So the top-down established the content-related part, and the bottom-up approach resembles a kind of quantitative content analysis, where we, for instance, used an Vivo program to obtain word frequency of our data that we manually searched the text file with. So in the end, we ended up with 8 codes. We defined 8 codes during these processes, as you can see on this slide in the middle. We performed the coding with the software encoder, and we got pretty good results. And you can see the full code book also in the paper. So I want to elaborate a little bit on the coding part, because to get a firmer conceptual grip of the data, the coding part is specifically worth highlighting, I believe, since underlying rationales and tools like encoder offer a structured way to model codes without making the researcher lose themselves in data or interpretations. So for instance, how you get to operationalize the qualitative components in the epistemic frame, which provide qualitative feedback to the researcher, that definition holds grounds. However, different approaches to the data raises fundamental questions also around knowledge construction and how different epistemological principles affect the intelligence produced. So I believe, for instance, how you could combine the often addressed inductive or deductive approaches in research like this might actually impinge on the capabilities to create a fair sample of the world, although these approaches are, of course, not all clear-cut. So an example of that is related to processing data through encoder, as I mentioned, and delimiting appropriate code words, as these are the grounds for further analysis that impact on research and practice. So especially related to what you can call the single word approach, and that I want to point out is not an instrumental coding of a single word, which demands the researcher to invest a lot of time delving into different background matters. And I also believe that one dimension of this is related to the approach, theory, data management tool relationship within QE, and the differences in how you end up knowing your data and what you can say about it is reflexive between these components and contingent on the epistemological orientation, where, for instance, you use a deductive approach, you go to the theories, you establish the epistemic frame, and you use the tools. Whereas if you take a more inductive approach, you use the tools, you establish the epistemic frame, and then the theories. So just some unfinished reflections that I wanted to share with you guys. And to move on, the coded data was later used with epistemic network analysis web tool. And we used a lot of settings. For instance, the units were the countries, the conversation, we set the metadata and dates, and we also used the moving stanza window of size 10 due to the uncertainty in code words between the rows and so on. So, and here you can see the result. 3 models were analyzed. First, we analyzed the units, centered its position in the XY projection space to obtain a general perspective on the differences between the Brazilian and Swedish discourses. We modeled the subtraction network, and we modeled 2 separate mean networks. So this was done to obtain an in-depth picture of the differences or similarities between the 2 countries. So just shortly, and I know, Stefano, you will soon go into a lot more of this, but Brazil's position in the left dimension of the x-axis relates more firmly to democracy, while, for instance, the Brazilian government clearly acted with authority and centralized governance, whereas Sweden's position on the right side of the dimension relates more firmly to the discourse around inequality. So it was centered on decentralization and local demands distributed across governmental agencies and societal entities. Go ahead, Stefano.
Okay, good, thank you. So here a brief discussion. We have here the state entity subjective as the paper proposition, the specificities, the country issues, and the general, the global issues, and their mutual determinacy. Observing Brazilian education on COVID-19, we could see a centralization of decision-making by the Ministry of Education, while in Sweden, we saw a decentralized decision-making, stronger in local level with the principles. And looking into it, we observed that in Brazil, we had an alliance between authoritarian conservatives and the advancement of neoliberal agendas. While in Sweden, we have an intimacy between politics, Swedish politics, and the advancement of neoliberal agendas. And to help us understand it, we decided to see these theories of how they help us understand what is happening. So we took Robert Dahl in the Modern Democracy in the 20th century, where the state action was towards universal citizenship and mechanisms for effective citizen participation in public power. So it's the main happening in the 20th century, where education was a key, where education is still a key to build the citizen personality. Here in neoliberalism, since the 70s and the 80s, Wendebrow has been seeing that we have a resignification of the state now to build the citizen subjectivity of economization of political life and sacrificial citizenship, where the re-education is a key. We needed to re-educate states to perform more close to the market laws, competitions, prizes, goals, and etc. And to have re-education as a key, that's where education starts to have more goals, more competition, more prizes. Our education changed. States changed, and the state action to build the new citizenship also changed. So we have a neoliberalism as a huge intervention with the state to build the liberal condition of existence. That is the liberal utopia of the last century. And we have relating neoliberal democracy with social inequalities, we have the individual economic growth starts to be the main driver to overcome social inequalities by juridically equal citizens in meritocratic disputes. Also, we need a re-education for that. We have a lot of change in education in the last decade. So to conclude, we have in Brazil the use of states to make change in education to develop neoliberal subjectivity, which important impacts on social inequality. So the Brazilian discourse is much more about democracy, because we in COVID-19 pandemic, we had the state driving the change for achieve the neoliberal democracy. So we have a speech more and more focused on democracy, but with high impact in social inequality. We have a huge social inequality here, and it's becoming more drastic. And in Sweden, we have a more permissive politics for specialists to make decisions about collective decisions with important impacts on democracy. So while Sweden was paying much more attention on social inequality and how to keep the low social inequality, we have the not so evident problem of democracy when citizens do not look so much to the democracy actions, because they have a trust in the state that not every time is more linked to democracy issues. So we have a sacrificial citizenship where we just abdicate to have a political life in order to believe that economic life is going to solve our problems as we have better rank in society. So we have two trends of actual manifestation of neoliberalism and the minimization of participation in public state power. That is authoritarianism, that is more close to Brazil, and sacrificial citizenship that is more close to Sweden. So a few words. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Stefano and Caroline. In the interest of time, we'll move right to the next presentation, which is Changes, Longings, and Potentials for Future Pedagogical Practices, Investigating University Teachers' Experiences During the Spring 2020 Lockdown. If I think I saw you.
Yeah, we're here, me and Emil. I don't know if you can see my screen. I just tried to share it.
Yes, I see it. Looks great.
Perfect. Okay. So my name is Leonie and this is Emil Bøløgaard, and we're both graduate students here at University of Copenhagen, and we co-wrote this paper with Ruth Horak, Maria Stenald, and Morten Misfeldt. So this is a collaboration between the Center for Digital Education and the more administrative part of the university, signified by Ruth Horak and Data and Systems. The paper is called Changes, Longings, and Potentials for Future Pedagogical Practices, Investigating University Teachers' Experiences During the Spring 2020 Lockdown. So our case is to look at how COVID caused lockdowns in Denmark, and more specifically at University of Copenhagen. And what we're interested in is how teachers who were not used to teach digitally, what concern it raised for them to have to translate their normal pedagogical activities into a digital format over the course of approximately 4 days, which they had from the Prime Minister said you have to make it online, until they had to make it online because campus was closed. And to follow this, the university deployed a cross-university working group who issued a survey, among other things, where they asked teachers many different questions. But among these, their prior experience, and what we found was that it was quite limited. So they were asked what best describes your experience with online teaching methods. As you can see, they were asked both in 2020, in fall 2020, and in spring 2021. And in spring 2020, 44.1 said that they had no experience with online teaching methods. So this was the situation for our analysis and for the data that we employed. And what we were interested in asking is the following research question. What concerns about transitioning to digital teaching did teachers at UCPH describe during a spring 2020 survey? How did these concerns interrelate, and what perception of digital teaching does this indicate? Yeah.
So our empirical material is the survey, but more specifically, 3 specific open-ended questions in the survey. One question on what the teachers changed in their remote teaching practice, and a second question on what they missed the most from teaching on campus, and a third question on whether or not they saw any positive aspects of online teaching that they hoped would continue when they got back to campus. So these 1,365 replies were our
Total data material.
total data material.
Yeah.
And because we had so many replies, we used encoder to sort of try to semi-automated code the replies. So our coding process was quite inductive insofar as we developed the codes very much from the level of the replies. That is, we read them and tried to identify some initial words that were indicative of specific themes. And then we worked through and with encoder to try to develop a list of words and phrases that were indicating the specific themes, and like try to narrow it down and make it more precise, expanding or limiting the rules of these codes. So a very collaborative effort between us and also encoder. But we ended up with 6 codes: analog and digital elements in teaching, and flexibility, interaction with students, teaching formats, and time and salary. But however, there was a quite large variation in the frequency of the codes. So digital elements in teaching, interaction with students, and the teaching formats, they make up quite the majority of the codes and the materials, which we'll get back to.
Yeah. So on these codes, on these materials, we employed the epistemic network analysis because we wanted to gain this understanding of digital teaching. We thought that if we could see what concerns they would put together, connect through these different questions, then we'd get a better understanding of their view on digital teaching as well. So our units for the analysis was these 3 questions and the replies from the teachers within these different questions. These was the foundation for our conversations as well. So in our model, we end up having 3 networks, 1 for each question, which looks like this.
And given that interaction with student, teaching formats, and digital elements were by far the most pronounced codes, it's not really a surprise that this trinity of codes make up the most important connection across the 3 different questions
as well.
So in the first question, in what they had changed in their remote teaching practice, we see a relation between teaching formats and digital elements, and between interaction with students and digital elements. In the second question, on what they missed from teaching on campus, we see a very clear connection between teaching formats and interaction with students. And in the third question, on the positive aspects, we see a relation between teaching formats and digital elements. So regarding the first question on what they changed, we see in the relationship between teaching formats and digital elements that what caused them to change their praxis was simply the use or discovery of digital elements of platforms such as Zoom or Padlet, recordings in general, which makes sense given that many of them had very little prior experience. But we also see that in the relationship between interaction with students and digital elements, that they also changed their practice because some specific digital element either limited or enabled interaction with students, which they found very important. Which in the middle graph or model, you can also see that what they missed the most is by far the interaction with students during their online teaching. And funnily enough, in the third model and the third question, the positive aspects, we see that a clear relation between the teaching formats and the digital elements, because they see that certain digital elements, such as, for example, recorded lectures, are great and could work as great supplements or support on-campus teaching, while there is almost no relationship between teaching formats and interaction with students. In fact, it's the only model where there's not a really clear connection between interaction and the other two other codes, because they simply find that the online tools and online ways of teaching were quite limiting in their interaction with students.
Yeah, so comparing these three models is also very interesting, that the only place where we see a really clear and like bigger connection between teaching formats and interaction with students is when they talk about the campus education, right? So that's the only place where they connect that to a specific possibility for interaction with students and with changing. In the first one, it's if they want to change their interaction with students, they have to change the digital elements. They don't change the teaching formats necessarily, as that's from the digital, like that's the digital elements that determine what they'll end up using. So summing up, we see, first off, we see a significant difference in the mean values of the three questions, which is not that surprising as it's three different questions. So we hope that they would answer differently to them. We also see, we try to name these two dimensions that we see in the chart. So on the y-axis, we see digital teaching vocabulary versus on-campus vocabulary. Sorry, that's a really hard word for me to pronounce, apparently. In the upper quadrants, we saw there was mostly digital elements that were differed from interaction with students and from these analog teaching methods that we saw in the previous year. If we look at the x-axis, we see experience, their actual experiences. So where they talk about their experiences, this is this trinity that Emil talked about, this triangle of things, with teaching formats, interaction with students, and digital teaching. And then on the other side, the conditions, flexibility, time and salary, which were conditions for the teaching or conditions that they would talk about would impact whether or not they would change their teaching later on. And summing up, we see that teachers' primary concerns about the transitioning was about how they could ensure interaction with students. This concern interrelated with concerns about what teaching formats that would facilitate this, and particularly questions as to whether digital elements is capable of this. And this comes across from the other material, or this is supported by the materials from the rest of the working group that they found as well. And is also what we see in our ENA analysis. So thank you very much for your time. This was our last slide.
Thank you so much. Really interesting work. I see that there is a question in the chat that we will answer just in a few minutes after our final presenter, last but not least by any means. But it looks like it's one that might be valid for several of the presentations that were shared for this section. The final presentation is Reflections of Healthcare Workers on their in-hospital experiences during the onset of COVID-19. Danielle, are you our presenter for this section?
Oh, Stephanie is already camera on. She's ready.
Fabulous. Thank you, Stephanie.
Of course, let me share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen okay? Perfect. Well, hi everyone. Great to see all of you today. Thank you for joining the session. My name is Stephanie, and Megan and Lana and I will walk you through our presentation of Reflections of Healthcare Workers on their in-hospital experiences during the onset of COVID-19. So to begin, we did this study as part of the data challenge, and we chose to examine the Nocturnus podcast, which was comprised of audio diary entries from healthcare workers in the first 4 months of the pandemic in the US. When we listened to these entries, there was a richness in the raw vulnerability expressed by the challenges of healthcare workers in what they were experiencing during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was very exciting for us to examine and even explore in the results, as you'll hear today. As a quick overview of what we analyzed in the data, in the study, as mentioned, the study consists of audio diary recordings by healthcare workers identified in the Nocturnus podcast as part of the series named Stories from a Pandemic. As mentioned, these audio diaries were recorded between March 2020 through June 2020 from healthcare workers from 13 different states across the US, and we had one from Canada as well. The healthcare workers served in various roles such as doctors, nurses, medical interns, and other hospital-based roles, while there were over 50 audio diary entries in total. We only examined audio diary entries from healthcare workers who reflected on their in-hospital work experience from the pandemic. And this just ensured a more cohesive analysis of a shared context of healthcare workers early on in the pandemic. What was excluded from our examination were any entries that referred to non-hospital experiences, such as being at home sick with COVID and sharing experiences on their disease. This resulted in the examination of 40 entries, and the audio diaries reflect on the day-to-day hospital experiences of the healthcare workers during the first 3 months of the COVID-19 outbreak. The healthcare workers were anonymous in the study, and to verify the accuracy of the transcriptions, each researcher listened to the original audio diary entry to ensure accuracy of the transcript and made minor adjustments accordingly. And the transcribed audio diaries, the transcribed audio diaries were categorized based on the healthcare workers' experiences by professional, personal, and emotional constructs. And our team conducted ground analysis of this data by looking at the professional and personal constructs that were examined in this study. So moving on a little bit more into our methods, the coding process involved annotating when an emotional construct was identified in connection to a professional or personal construct. And when a professional or personal or emotion construct was mentioned, we identified that as well. And occurrences of different emotions related to the same professional or personal construct were annotated with multiple codes, and each audio diary entry was coded independently by 2 raters, followed by a process of social moderation to reach an agreement on the final coding of the data. An analysis of the data was carried out in 2 stages. The first stage, we examined constructs using ENA and the models that were generated to look at the connections between professional and personal constructs, and then among emotion constructs. A single audio diary entry was defined in the study as both the unit of analysis and the conversational unit within which all connections were contained. And the second stage of our analysis, we actually used heat maps as well, which Lana will explain further in just a moment. So here is an example of our codebook of professional and personal constructs used in the analysis, for example. And next we have our codebook of emotion constructs used in analysis. Now Megan will continue to take us through the methodology as well.
Thank you, Stephanie. So here is a coded sample utterance that shows an example of how we coded professional, personal, and emotion constructs. So the line highlighted in red was coded for resource availability, as the individual stated a lack of available medical ICUs in the hospital at that time. The line highlighted in green was coded for the emotion construct fatigue, expressing feelings of chaos and intensity, whereas the line highlighted in yellow was coded for grateful and purpose, as they express feelings of excitement and purposefulness. So moving on to the results section. Here are 2 figures, figure 1 and figure 2, displaying the ENA models of professional and personal constructs. So figure 1 shows the overall network model for the 9 professional and personal constructs from March to June of 2020. The strongest connection is seen between resource availability and medical treatment, indicating an overall emphasis on professional constructs related to equipment, resources, and medical intervention for patients. The top left of figure 2 displays the means and confidence intervals of audio diary entries by month. So as the months go from March to May and June of 2020, the means move up and to the right, indicating a shift from connections between policies, resource availability, and medical treatment to routine, purpose, and psychosocial support. The top right of figure 2 displays the connections of March of 2020. The bottom left displays the connections of April of 2020, and the bottom right shows connections of May and June of 2020. So overall, there's a shift to a more balanced network and varied reflections towards May and June of 2020. And then moving on to figure 3 and figure 4. These display the ENA models of emotion constructs. So figure 3 shows the overall network model for the 9 emotion constructs from March to June of 2020. The overall strongest connection is seen between fear and uncertainty, indicating the reflection of strong negative emotions. So the top left of figure 4 displays the means and confidence intervals, emotion constructs reflected in audio entries by month. From March to May and June of 2020, the means move left to right, indicating a shift from grateful to sadness. The top right model shows the connections between emotion constructs of March of 2020. The bottom left model displays the connections between emotion constructs of April, and the bottom right model displays the connections between emotion constructs of May and June of 2020. So overall, there's a shift from left to right, where March showed strong connections to grateful, fear, and uncertainty, and shifted to emotion constructs of compassion, sadness, and uncertainty for the months of May and June of 2020. And then Lana, I'll be passing it on to her to showcase the heat maps.
Thank you, Megan. So just as Stephanie mentioned, when we try to include both emotion and professional or personal constructs in the same ENA model, it became challenging because we needed to identify connections between emotion and professional or personal constructs. So we decided to have a try with heat maps. It helped us visualize the frequency of emotions reflected in conjunction to professional or personal construct in any given utterance. So as you can see here, we used a gradient lighter shades of blue to indicate lower frequencies of the emotion in relation to the construct, and darker blues to indicate higher frequencies. This figure depicts an overall heat map of emotion connected to professional or personal constructs from March to June 2020. The highest co-occurrence are uncertainty with medical treatment, anger and fear with policies, and then fear with resource availability. And moving on to the next slide, this figure shows individual heat maps by month of emotion constructs related to professional or personal constructs. For March 2020, the highest frequency is anger with policies, followed by fear with resource availability. And then 1 month later in April 2020, this shifts to uncertainty with medical treatment, followed by anticipation with medical treatment, although the overarching emotion across several constructs was fear. And then in May to June 2020, the highest occurrence is uncertainty with purpose, followed by growing sadness across various constructs. And that's how heat maps help us visualize the relationship between the emotion and professional or personal constructs more clearly. And moving on to the end, to wrap up, this paper provided insights around the complex reflection conveyed by healthcare workers in audio diaries regarding their in-hospital experiences during the onset of COVID-19. And here are some of our takeaways. So first of all, uncertainty was definitely a prominent emotion throughout May to June 2020. And then the second point is that there was a shift from responding to immediate needs, such as resource availability in March, to deeper reflections, such as psychosocial support and purpose in May to June 2020. And then we also detected emotions internalization in the 4 months stage, such as anger and gratefulness in March, versus sadness and compassion in the May to June 2020. And we definitely have our limitations in this study. This time we only focused on what was said in a text-based transcript instead of fully using the audio diaries. So in the future, we may consider including the vocal reflection into our study. But overall, these study results document the unique vantage point of healthcare workers during a historic global pandemic and bring awareness and insights to better support the mental well-being of healthcare workers in the future. And that's all of our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, team. Wow, I love the connections you made between the use of heat maps and the epistemic networks that you presented. That's so interesting. So I want to open up the floor at this time for everyone to ask any questions they might have for all of these presenters. But I will start by synthesizing to give everyone a moment to think about those ideas. The first question, which was asked by Presley. And I believe what Presley's asking about is for any of the presentations that are thinking about epistemic networks in political discourse or focusing on any kind of state or citizen types of deliberation. How does your work fit into any potential larger body of work that might be using QE approaches to understand those kinds of discourse and deliberation? This could be for a couple of presentations.
Amanda, could you say that one again? I was trying to read the chat and I feel like I missed the question.
So is there other work that you have done or that you've read that is using QE to understand political discourse, debate, deliberation? Did you draw on that when you were designing your study?
I guess, well, I can speak for myself really quickly. Like I tried to put our work within conversation, in conversation with the work that Hamilton and Hobbes had done last year. But to be honest, the order of things is kind of funny because we actually finished our analysis previous to that. So I think in some ways they moved past where we were. It just took a while for everything to come out. I also just saw that there was a question about sentiment analysis in the domain of politics. If Presley, if you're referring to like using kind of automated sentiment analysis, I'm not aware of that, but I think in the Hamilton and Hobbes paper, they're clearly looking at kind of patterns of sentiment and emotion and affect. I really liked the last group that just presented, obviously did kind of a deep dive looking at patterns of emotions. And there's some other work done by Carr and Fry who's looked at constellations of emotions using ENA as well. But I don't think in the context, at least I'm not aware of things that have happened in the context of a political domain. So, but I think that's a good idea going forward.
Absolutely. So Melanie asks, oh, sorry, is there someone asking a question?
No, I actually wanted to add a little bit to that question. I think from some of the multimodal analytics stuff that Maldonado and other people have done, where we begin to combine, let's say data-driven results with epistemic network analysis, then I could see a role for sort of like machine sentiment analysis as, as potentially a way to combine it, especially with those nice heat maps too, which also struck me. So I think not necessarily in political discourse, but in other forms of ENA that have sort of investigated sort of interactions and performance in medical teams or group work to go forward. Sorry, I have running out of battery on my headphones. So yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question across many levels, both technically, but also, from the discourse, notion of what is sentiment and how is it expressed, across different cultures as well, or within subcultures. Excellent question.
Brendan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Thanks to everyone for their presentations. I thought they were great. My question was for the last group that just presented, I think from Pepperdine and the data challenge. I really liked the analysis that you did, and I had kind of a specific question about whether or not you considered or used means rotations at all in the modeling that you did. Because if you look at the emotional, so I guess I'll ask that question first and then just a follow-up. In the second thing that you shared, there was a really nice kind of temporal progression of the networks, right? It went from month to month.
Yeah.
And that looked like it wasn't even using a means rotation, which I think was kind of cool if we think about the, yeah, Danielle's shaking her head no. So there's that I thought was very interesting to look at the progression of the constellations of emotions being expressed over time. And even that just kind of fell out naturally from the data doing an SVD. But it might also be interesting to do that if you didn't try it with the first analysis as well, to line up the temporal aspect from that first model too, to see if you similarly see a shift in time. I remember some of this work at the data challenge. I think it's fantastic. And I'm really eager to, as kind of Presley was getting at too, it'd be really cool to see how to strike balances between these constellations of things. And use difficult choices, right? There's a lot of richness in both of those models, but I think it would be really cool to explore, as Daniel was saying, like ways in which those could be potentially braided together. But anyways, nice work.
I thought that was really cool too. I love anything that shows like trajectories or changes in discourse and ways of thinking about things over time. So I want Melanie asked a question in the chat, and it was for the final presentation. She asked, how did you handle the ethics in the study, seeing that you worked with emotions, among other things?
I'm checking to see if anybody from our team wants to take that on. And maybe, Melanie, if you want to clarify what you meant by ethics, just so we know what the direction of the question is meant, that might be what I think some of our team members are curious. And we'll say that we did, in terms of determining the emotions, we did adapt it from the Plutchik's wheel of emotions, if that helps.
So I think the data that you collected was publicly available. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes. So you could go Google this podcast, and it's all posted on the website. It even lists where the locations were at, but they didn't use name. Or I think they did actually.
They used references to location and position. So for example, there was like as an example, it would say geriatric nurse in California, age 50. So it would give some sort of examples of that, but we scrubbed that data when we were going through the analysis. But this was all this data was publicly available through the podcast, Nocturnus podcast, Stories from a Pandemic. So in our paper, we share the web link. So if you are interested in looking at it further, it's there as well.
And thanks for clarifying that. So, and to add to that, essentially this podcast invited healthcare workers. So they voluntarily chose to record themselves. And then the podcast selected ones that they felt were best representative of. They were actually regrouped thematically rather than chronologically, but then we reorganized it to be chronological.
Gotcha.
Hi, sorry, it's Melanie. So I was just worried about, because I'm a psychologist, so it seems like you had intense emotions there. And I was just worried about the people actually afterwards. I know it's not your responsibility necessarily, but was it ever followed up? Or that's what I mean by the ethics actually. So what happened to these people? Were they actually supported? Did someone follow up on them? Because yeah, it seemed like an intense, very interesting, wonderful study. I'm so excited about this method, but I was just wondering about that.
Good question. So this was a secondary data source for us. So like we didn't collect it. So because all of the participants were anonymous, we weren't involved in any follow-up. And I don't think that the podcast individuals necessarily did that. I will say there were additional entries that were beyond the time period that we looked at that were probably maybe reflected a shift in mindset, because for the most part, a lot of them use this as a cathartic way of dealing with the situation. So can't answer your question in particular, but good thought for keeping that in mind as a follow-up study. Maybe if that podcast were to kind of go back to those individuals and ask them to record their thoughts now a year later and see what kind of support they receive, etc.
Yeah, it's always an important consideration, and I think it's always hard when you're collecting online data that has a layer of anonymity to it. Not entirely, but important considerations nonetheless. I have a question for Stefano and your team. So what I noticed in both the presentation and the paper was that, you know, you started with this interest in understanding democracy and inequality in these two contexts, which is fantastic. And then it seemed like after you, later in the paper and later in the presentation, you contextualized that by sharing with us some information about different political structures and neoliberalism and the theory behind it, which I think is wonderful. But my question is, was that something that you knew you were interested in before you created the models, or was that something that was more of a grounded theory approach where you had the models and you understood these different relationships between themes in each political group, and then you looked and explored these theories to make sense of what you learned from the models? Was it, I guess it's a chicken or the egg question.
Well, I think at least how I'm used to work, I think that we have some backgrounds in our minds, so we can't avoid them when we are reading the reality. But I think more in a dialectical perspective. We start reading the reality from our background and our social experiences, and then some things, some theories or some impressions just come to the mind, and we start to look for some answers that other people have written about, and etc. And in this case, I knew better Robert Dahl perspective, but this empirical case we had was an opportunity for me to read Wendy Brown. I did not read it very intense before. So, but when I wanted to read it because we are living this authoritarianism in Brazil. I'm from Brazil. I'm here. I have my PhD that makes do research about it. So, but put in a few words, when I started to see the reality, yes, started to change a little bit the research question I had in my mind, at least, because I was not trying to adapt the reality to the framework I had, but I was letting the reality change the questions I'm making, because the questions they are always changing since you get to know better the reality. So it's what I'm denominating dialectics. So I think that this dialectic is going all the time. So when we get to the conclusion, we need to review our question, because just state the question as we started is somehow a way to just stabilize or to put a pattern in society. And I think it's not a good thing we should do. So it is all the time influencing each other. The background we had and the empirical answers we're getting. And now, after, I don't know, 6 months of our conclusions, I think it's good because ICQE make us have a fast way to understand what's happening. So I think it's a really nice resource. So now, when doing the presentation today and thinking about our actual reality, I think it's really nice to see how it's changing. So, but I think I'm deviating now. So.
No, I think that's what really stuck out to me about your work is I see a lot of examples of QE approaches that have that sort of deductive, I have this model and I want to apply it to this context. But I think that what this shows is that can be limiting if you stick to that rigidly and you aren't interrogating what you're understanding from your models and connecting it to the existing theory as you go. I think that is an important part of this process. So that stood out to me a lot about this presentation. I have one other question for Brendan. So this is maybe a bit of a devil's advocate question a little, but
Sure.
what would you say is the perfect pattern of deliberation? If you could craft a perfect epistemic network, would it be completely balanced? Would it be holistic? Would it be emphasizing one thing or another?
For like deliberative discourse?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, the one ideal could be, I think we're still, part of the work is to continue to work on defining those norms. But one ideal could be that people feel that it was fair and that you maybe reached consensus or something, and that every stakeholder felt like that their concerns were taken care of, right? And maybe coming from a place where there isn't agreement and there's a lot of maybe conflicting interests. I think that's just kind of off the top of my head. I think one of the things that that's been debated when we've shared this work with some others who focus on civics and ethics in education is one of the things we talk about is at Kansas State University, they're engaging with each other's ideas. And there's this kind of, I think among some people, there's this reticent to want to engage with certain types of ideas because they think it violates something that's too core to who you are. You don't want to be moved by certain things. There's certain lines that I won't cross, right? And so that is something we didn't directly address here, but I think that would be something where, like, are there certain non-starters or things that are off the table that would enter into deliberation? I think that muddies and complicates defining some of these ideals. But I think generally, like, if I had to try to imagine, it would be that you'd have multiple parties coming from different perspectives, maybe different commitments and other things coming together and feeling heard, sharing those ideas and seeing those things balanced in some sort of resolution. It's nice to describe the ideal, isn't it? Obviously and there's probably other better articulations of that than I have. I mean, Peter did a lot of work kind of pulling from Habermas and Habermas's ideals of political discourse in terms of saying, okay, so you have these public spheres, and we talk about how that's connected from people's personal private lives up until like the institutional level where decisions are getting made. So Habermas is probably better, and Peter could probably do that better justice in terms of describing it. But I think what's important is to try to work towards certain norms and define some of those things. And at least from our perspective, if we're thinking about trying to bring this into an educational sphere, if you can't measure it, people aren't going to care about it, right? And especially at scale, that's one of the biggest challenges. Is that unfortunately, if you can't measure it, then people don't think it's there. And one of the potential benefits that we've been exploring of using QE and ENA is that if we can actually get some sort of meaningful grip on these phenomena, then we might be able to get those into curriculum and actually talk about what it would look like. So I think, because typically a lot of times you think about like, oh, Tufts was really great, they're aligning to expert views. But I think what was kind of nice about this analysis was to say, well, alignment with expert views is not the only goal here, especially for deliberative skills and civic skills. Yeah, that's a great question, Amanda. Thank you.
I think it's a really fascinating topic for further exploration. And I think you make a really good point. I think as educators, we might know when that deliberative discourse is happening. You're like, oh, there's some magic happening right now. But it's hard to conceptualize what it is that is actually happening. And I think epistemic networks like the ones you were showing could help educators understand that when it's happening. And also point out in if you expand this to other contexts, which I would love to see, can we see what an echo chamber looks like in terms of what modeling the epistemic discourse, or can we see when there's non-productive deliberation happening or productive deliberation? I think that's and it sounds like there's other work that's thinking about this as well. So I learned so much from this presentation.
I had one more thing that you made me think of. One of the other things that might be key is this concept of transactivity. How much we engage with each other's ideas and build with each other's ideas. And you'd want to see the transactivity from people that have conflicting views or conflicting interests. That would be another good indicator of, I think, a healthy deliberative process.
Can we connect that to the social networks of the relationships between those in the discourse? Anyway, we could go on about this forever. So there's a minute or two left before we end our session. Are there any final questions for our presenters?
Well, I have one to Brendan and the team to keep in this. Brendan, I think reading your paper, I think it was really nice to see how you managed to articulate the Habermas theory to the deliberation proposal with NA. I think you were very brave, because it's really difficult to do it, because it has an idealist theory that is so much philosophical, trying to articulate personal interests, some kind of individualism with solidarity, with solidarism. And I think you really showed us how to help operationalize some philosophical theories. That is one of the difficult things when you do philosophy, that you can't approach so much the reality because you are thinking about some things that you can't really pick off the reality.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think it's a really nice thing you did. You really managed to articulate it. I was really happy reading it. And one thing I would like to ask you is, we have some problems with deliberations when we do not have the perception of, I will use here the Hannah Arendt concept, the banality of the evil. When we can't see sometimes how our lack of critical thinking is making the evil become banal, the banality of the evil. And we can easily mistake the good logical thinking with a good thinking in a moral sense. And I don't know if you thought about it during your article, but I think you really opened a really nice window to think about it, articulating ENA with this deliberation theory. And I don't know, what do you think about it? What did you see when you were asking to the people about some things like racism, etc.? How it could be really enlightened by the use of the articulation of this key ENA with this deliberation theory?
Yeah.
I don't know if I was very clear, but
no, I think so.
Yeah, okay.
I just want to also thank you for your kind words. I think a lot of the quality of that paper is also coming from the deep expertise in thinking from Peter and from David on this. And we've actually, as I mentioned before, our study started, but well before the Woodson and or the Hamilton and Hobbes paper came out. And we've done some subsequent analyses. I'd love to follow up actually talking to you about those, because I think I would enjoy your perspective on them that just haven't come out yet. We haven't had a chance to publish them. But I think in terms of one of the things that struck me when looking at the data for this is considering trying to honor people's experiences. So like a lot of times people are bringing in their personal experiences and describing how they believe social systems work. Right. And so that could be anecdotal thinking or saying like, well, my mom overcame these issues. Like she came from nothing and like this kind of classic pulled herself up by her bootstraps narrative. And I think when people have a certain set of experiences or vision or exposure to things, you can start to understand where their viewpoint comes from. But you can also see, and I think this is where like the discussion at Tufts comes into play is how they might miss systematic issues or problems that other people face just because they've never been exposed to it. And the benefit of how like having the skills of exposing, not only looking at research there, but also hearing other people's stories. I mean, research is just another storytelling and amplification and maybe distillation of other people's stories. So I think that like one of the pieces that has been really interesting, and I kind of mentioned before, is people's reticence or like fear around being in deliberative discussions and how social media and media just generally pushes us away and amplifies that fear and doesn't actually help us develop the skill sets to think, okay, I can stay in this space. I can listen to someone that disagrees with me on something that's very core to who I am or who I care about or things that I care about, and still maintain a sense of trust and patience and willingness to engage around those issues. And so I think to me, that's one of the reasons it's very motivational. And I think I've seen a degradation of that in like Wisconsin used to be famous to toot our own horn for a second. We used to be famous for kind of political balance and operating in good faith, where different political parties would actually trust one another. That has gone away by the wayside, where you used to have legislatures would meet with each other every week. One of my family members was a state senator, and they would meet with people from the opposite side of the aisle and talk all the time and have lunch, and they trusted each other. That discourse is gone. There's no trust. There is not as much good faith, at least within our state, and I think within the United States more broadly, and I think that's maybe true globally as well. So reestablishing that trust in norms is important. And I think it's important for citizens as well as politicians to be able to do, but it's not easy. And I loved the Hamilton and Hobbes paper because it kind of gets at some of the kind of fundamental emotional patterns that we can fall into and how we just all of a sudden we're divorced from the topic. That doesn't mean we don't honor the emotional experience. That's real. But it has to be also thought about and maybe say, well, why am I having this reaction? Is this about this issue, or is it because I feel threatened as a human, or my group is threatened, or people or ideas that I care about are threatened? And balancing those when you might not trust that the person on the other side isn't cynical and trying to do something that's maybe underhanded or evil, depending on how you look at it. So that's a great question. Stefano, we should follow up more because I think this is probably a much longer, deeper conversation.
I would be very happy. Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Well, that we are at time for this paper session. Thank you to all our presenters and for those of you who asked great questions. I had a blast. I don't know how much longer this Zoom session room can stay open, but I definitely would encourage you to reach out to the authors or each other if you have further questions or want to follow up. Yes, and then as Danielle pointed out, there is a community chat that is open right now. So I would suggest we all transition there to further the conversation. Thank you.